What's up, everybody? Mr. Fantini here. Welcome back. So in our last video, we kind of had a bad time, right? We talked about some of the main causes that dragged the country into the greatest economic crisis in American history, the Great Depression. In this video, we're going to turn the corner and talk about some of the proposed solutions to that crisis, as well as meeting one of the main protagonists of 20th century American history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But first, let's just briefly recap what got us into this mess. In our last video, we discussed the irresponsible business and finance practices that translated the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties into a giant bubble that burst, crashing the stock market and throwing the economy into the Great Depression. We also discussed how industrial and agricultural producers kind of put themselves out of business through excessive borrowing and overproduction, which drove down their own prices and put many companies out of business. We discussed how the crash of the stock market led to millions of Americans losing their savings and thousands of businesses going under, which led to a rise in unemployment, and how all these factors together led to a drop in confidence in the American economy, which further caused people to slow down their spending, which totally derailed the new consumer-driven economy. Lastly, we talked about how these man-made factors combined with one of the worst ecological disasters in American history, the Dust Bowl, where over-farming and extreme drought rendered millions of acres of farmland in the Midwest completely unusable and led to a gigantic refugee crisis where people were fleeing their homes, mostly to the West Coast in California. And while all this horrible stuff was happening and destroying the lives of millions of Americans, the Herbert Hoover administration did nothing. Well, not literally nothing, but the administration stuck to its laissez-faire beliefs that the government shouldn't intervene in the economy and basically told the American people to stick it out and stay strong while the economy figured itself out. As you might imagine, those laissez-faire principles weren't particularly comforting or nourishing to Americans who were losing their homes and going hungry. And so in the 1932 election, Americans were desperate for a new promise of radical change to get the country out of this mess. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR as he's commonly called. Now, you probably realize that this is not the first Roosevelt that we've met on our voyage here, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was second cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, who was president just 30 years earlier. FDR idolized his cousin, and as a result, FDR totally followed in Teddy's footsteps throughout his political career, first becoming a New York state legislator, and then becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and then Governor of New York. He even ran as vice president in 1920 before ultimately becoming president in 1932. These are all positions that Teddy Roosevelt held. But beyond that, Franklin was also influenced by Teddy's political beliefs. And you might remember that Teddy Roosevelt was what we called a progressive, meaning that he believed that the government should be used to solve social problems. He did things like pass the Clean Food and Drug Act to prevent the addition of harmful substances into people's food. But by 1932, these progressivist beliefs in a government actively engaged in economic regulation had fallen by the wayside. And the previous several presidential administrations had all been staunch conservatives with belief in laissez-faire, non-intervention economic policy. FDR ran in 1932 promising a proactive and compassionate government that would provide relief to the average American. He called this a New Deal for the American people. That set of New Deal policies and organizations is going to be the focus of this video, and I don't want to spend too much time on the biographies of individuals here, but I feel like I would be remiss to not mention a little bit more about FDR's personal life. Before becoming president in 1932, his political career was almost completely derailed after contracting polio in 1921 and becoming paralyzed from the waist down. Due to the attitudes about physical disability at the time, the assumption was that his political career was over, and he actually spent several years out of the spotlight operating a health spa that provided therapy and medical attention for others with similar physical ailments. When he decided to re-enter politics, he not only overcame the physical challenges, but also challenged the public stigma around disability at the time that often equated disability with weakness. Largely due to this stigma, he would often force himself to give speeches standing up by using painful metal leg braces that he would wear under his pants and gripping the podium very tightly. This obviously must have been both physically and emotionally pretty painful. Although we're going to focus more on his policies than his personal story, we should acknowledge that FDR's presidency radically changed attitudes around physical disability in the United States. And with all that in mind, let's jump in and take a look at the New Deal. Economically, the New Deal was based upon jump-starting the American economy through public spending. Now, traditional conservative economics favored austerity in a depression, which basically means cutting spending, cutting social programs, and lowering spending until the economy picks back up again. This came from the belief that expanding public spending, especially if you were just simply printing money, could trigger runaway inflation, which is really, really bad for your economy. The New Deal, however, wasn't just printing and passing out money. The philosophy was to put as many people back to work as possible with government jobs. This policy was nicknamed priming the pump, and the belief was that it would kickstart the economy because by putting people back to work, you would also put wages back in their pockets, which would then give them more money to spend, which would then create more business for the private companies in the country. The most famous program to emerge out of the New Deal was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. And I'm just going to give you all a fair warning right now that the New Deal is a bit of an alphabet soup of programs. There's going to be a lot of three-letter acronyms in here. The important thing is that you understand the big picture philosophy of the New Deal and be able to put a couple examples to it. The main project of the WPA was to modernize American infrastructure. WPA workers built new roads and bridges, airports, tunnels, and even expanded public transportation and built public buildings like schools, courthouses, and post offices, and other things. This expansion of public infrastructure also included the expansion of public services and utilities, most famously electricity. A famous WPA program was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, which built tons of dams and power plants and ran electrical wires through the Tennessee Valley, which at the time was one of the most impoverished regions of the country. From there, the project of rural electrification spread out throughout the country. In the 1920s, only about 3% of all farmhouses had electricity access, but within 30 years, that number was over 90%. Due to programs like this, electricity went from a luxury to a universal utility in the United States. Ultimately, programs like these were a win-win for the American economy, because not only did it put millions of Americans back to work, but a more modernized infrastructure where transportation was easier and universal access to electricity actually made Americans more economically productive when the economy finally recovered. These services laid the groundwork for the economic boom that was going to come after World War II, but we'll hold off on that for right now. Beyond the expansion of public infrastructure and utilities, the WPA also saw an expansion of public services, such as expanding the public school system and providing public school lunches to all students. This not only provided nutritious food to students whose families might be struggling to feed them, but also allowed the government to purchase crops from struggling farmers and also put people to work in school cafeterias. The WPA even hired thousands of artists and musicians and writers and put them to work to improve the public good and public morale. Artists would be sent to small towns to paint murals in public buildings. And orchestras of WPA musicians would travel through impoverished communities and provide entertainment to boost morale. Now, depending on where you live, there's a pretty good chance that you see examples of the legacy of the Works Progress Administration and the New Deal every day as you go about your life. If you live in Philadelphia like me, you probably see New Deal projects every day of your life. The Federal Building in Center City with those big giant sculptures outside, those were a New Deal art project. If you've ever ridden SEPTA or PATCO over the Ben Franklin Bridge, those tracks were put there by the WPA. Every day when I take the subway from South Philly to North Philly, I remember that those tracks from Walnut Locust down were built by the Works Progress Administration. And then if you get on the subway going the other way and take it all the way south and hang out at FDR Park, it was called that because it was built during the New Deal. Some of our most beautiful school buildings, including the Central High School building and the old Bach School building, were New Deal projects. And I'm willing to bet that there's a good chance that your post office, like mine, was built during the New Deal. You can often recognize New Deal public buildings because they're pretty beautiful. The goal was to put people to work, so if they could put together a muralist to paint a wall or a carpenter to put in a specialty floor, they would often do those things just because it meant more work and ultimately a more beautiful product for the public. Another famous New Deal work program was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, which allowed young men to sign on for forestry and conservation work. Under this program, young men were paid to plant over 1 million trees in America's depleted forests, and did a ton of work in our national park system, building many of the lodges and roads that are still in use today. It's also interesting to note that the national park system was very much the brainchild of FDR's cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, and that this might have been his sort of way to add on his cousin's legacy. By the way, the Civilian Conservation Corps is still around today, and if you're looking for something to do for maybe a gap year between high school and college, that might be a cool opportunity for you. Ultimately, the goal of all of these programs was to put people to work in places where work could be done to improve the public good. We still enjoy the legacy of the New Deal today between our public roads and our public services like water and electricity and public schools. The New Deal established Social Security, which funds assistance to our most vulnerable citizens like the elderly and the disabled and orphan children. It also passed the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed all Americans the right to belong to a union. A public investment project of this magnitude was completely unheard of in the era of laissez-faire and remains incredibly radical even by today's standards. I mean, this was an incredibly expensive program. When the Works Progress Administration was first appropriated in 1935, it accounted for almost 7% of the GDP. And its goal was to provide meaningful work to anybody who wanted it, skilled or unskilled. By the end of the program, almost 9 million Americans had worked for the WPA at some point or another. But the long-term effects of programs like these was not just employment for the people in the short term, but a massive modernization of our infrastructure and facilities in the long term. Development projects like these supported the massive economic growth that would occur in the United States after World War II and allowed the United States to achieve the world's highest standard of living within 20 years of the program's implementation. In addition to priming the pump of the American economy by putting Americans back to work in public works projects, the other goal of the New Deal was restoring confidence in banking and regulating business and finance in order to prevent the irresponsible lending and investing that led to the stock market crash in 1929. Now, as far as the financial regulation side of this goal goes, I'm just going to make an executive decision and say that it's a little bit more technical than we need to go into at this time. If you want to become a finance historian or something like that, you can do a little bit of outside research. But for now, we'll just say that the government established new rules that would prevent banks and companies from lending and investing irresponsibly in order to prevent another bubble and crash. A little more tangible and useful for our purposes is how the FDR administration restored confidence in the American economy. One way they did this was by passing a law called the FDIC, which basically told Americans that their deposits in banks were guaranteed by the federal government, so that even if the bank went out of business, they would not lose their money. This encouraged Americans who maybe lost all their savings after their bank went out of business when the stock market crashed and had since been stuffing all their money under their mattress to put their money back in the bank so that it can be put into the finance system and help stimulate the economy. But beyond the technical and financial aspect of this economic recovery, a big part of how the average American experienced the New Deal was through a personal connection to FDR himself. The FDR administration was the first in American history where a decent chunk of the American population had household radios, and FDR used this new media to his advantage. Over the course of his presidency, he would periodically address the American people over the radio in what he called his fireside chats, which is an intentionally very cozy, very homey sounding name. And in these talks, he aimed to explain these economic projects in plain language and encourage them to buy in, both with their personal finances and in their sort of emotional morale in the direction of the country. This was the first time in American history, in world history really, when an average citizen could hear the voice of their leader coming into their home and seemingly addressing them personally. Personally and psychologically, this was a very powerful experience for Americans who were undergoing a period of extreme uncertainty and difficulty. And as a result of this, many Americans felt sincerely cared for by this president and developed a really strong affinity for him. Although polling data from this time period isn't the most reliable, FDR averaged about a 63% approval rating over his presidency, peaking at 83% in 1942, which is almost unheard of by today's standards. And to this day, about 80% of Americans view him favorably. Many Americans who lived through the Great Depression kept a framed portrait of FDR on their wall, if that gives you an idea of how significant he was to some people. For our primary sources today, because I do have a bonus one for you, we're going to be taking a look at this sort of relationship, this dialogue that kind of occurred between FDR and his constituents, by first taking a look at one of his fireside chats and then an interview with an American who listened to those chats on the radio. This is from FDR's second fireside chat from May 7th, 1933, 2 months after he became president. Tonight I come for the second time to tell you about what we have been doing and what we are planning to do. First, we are giving opportunity of employment to 250,000 of the unemployed, especially the young men, to go into forestry and flood prevention work. Next, Congress is about to pass legislation that will greatly ease the mortgage distress among farmers and the homeowners of the nation. All of us, the members of Congress and the members of this administration, owe you, the people of this country, a profound debt of gratitude. Now, the mere fact that the President of the United States was addressing average Americans in this kind of conversational tone was definitely deeply affecting to the American people, but I especially love that last line there, where he says that he and the members of Congress owe the people of the country a debt of gratitude. And to prove it to you, let's take a look at our bonus primary source for the day. This comes from several years later, an interview with a cotton mill worker named George Dobbin, recollecting what it was like to listen to the president on the radio. I do think that Roosevelt is the biggest-hearted man we ever had in the White House. It's the first time in my recollection that a president ever got up and said, "I'm interested in and aim to do something for the working man." Just knowing that for once there was a man to stand up and speak for him. A man that could make what he felt so plain nobody could doubt he meant it, has made a lot of us feel a lot better, even when there wasn't much to eat in our homes. And this kind of demonstrates that to some extent, Roosevelt was accomplishing exactly what he intended to do, to restore people's faith and confidence in the American economy and to get them willing to participate and spend and save and do the types of things that could help the economy get going again. And it's also worth noting that this sort of personal connection kept him pretty politically popular and made sure that he was able to win elections and continue to exercise his agenda. By the way, FDR was the only president to serve more than 2 terms in office. He was elected to the presidency 4 times over the course of the Great Depression and World War II, although he died during his 4th term. It wasn't until after his presidency that Congress passed a constitutional amendment limiting presidents to 2 terms. So in terms of big picture, FDR certainly accomplished a lot while he was in office. The country was in a better place when he died than it was when he became president. And he won 4 elections, meaning he was more president than anyone else, I guess. But does this mean that the New Deal and all of his programs were an unqualified success? Definitely not. The New Deal certainly helped the economy out of the Great Depression, and generally Americans were better off after the New Deal than they were before, but it was not immune to the racism of the time. Relief and job programs tended to favor white workers, especially in the South when they were being managed by Southern white political leaders. New Deal programs did not attempt to challenge Jim Crow segregation in the South, and this kind of inadvertently led to the displacement of many African American workers when Southern program heads favored white workers over black workers. And remember that Roosevelt was a Democrat, and at this time in American history, especially in the South, the Democratic Party was still very much associated with the ex-Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan. And so in order to pass New Deal legislation, Roosevelt had to work with Southern Democrats who were hostile to any gains for African Americans. For example, the Federal Housing Association, or FHA, tended to defer to segregation laws and denied African Americans mortgages in white neighborhoods. Shamefully, the Roosevelt administration failed to pass an anti-lynching law or expand black voting rights in the South. Certainly, the New Deal's greatest failure was its inability to address racism throughout American society, though I have to give a big shout out to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who lobbied hard to ensure that African Americans received at least a proportional amount of New Deal relief. As is the case with most things in American history, African Americans did not benefit as much as white folks from the New Deal. But many did benefit. And these New Deal programs were a big part of the initial shift of African American voters from the Republican Party, which was at the time still considered the party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party, which most African Americans support to this day. So, in conclusion, did the New Deal solve the Great Depression and create a truly just American economy? Absolutely not. Economic changes are super complex and usually very gradual. Some New Deal programs failed, while others remain crucial ingredients of our economy to this day. Over the course of the New Deal, unemployment ebbed and flowed, and there were periodic economic crises that led to new waves of business closures and layoffs and different solutions. It was an intensely complex process. And while it failed to address key areas of inequality, particularly racial inequality, it provided crucial relief to millions of suffering Americans. And by the end of the 1930s, most working Americans were much better off than they were at the start of the decade. Unfortunately, it would take another different crisis to bring about true economic revitalization and full employment in the United States. World War II, which we'll discuss next time. Thanks for listening. I'll see you then.